Hello everyone. I wanted to make this short video about Christian mysticism, mainly just because I love the Christian mystics and I'm always happy to have an excuse to speak of them, but also because I have an online weekend coming up in May where we will be exploring the perennial non-dual understanding with particular reference to Christian mysticism. When I was 7 years old, I apparently said to my mother that I thought that our life was God's dream, that everything was God's dream, and that our job in our lives was to make God's dream as beautiful a dream as possible. Well, as I grew up, I soon forgot or overlooked this childhood intuition and became immersed in growing up. But later on, in my mid to late teens, this intuition awoke in me again, and I set out on a path of inner exploration to try to re-find what I had intuited in my early childhood. And this took me on a great journey of exploration through Ouspensky's teachings, the Sufi tradition, the Mevlevi turning, Rumi's poetry, to the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition, where I learnt and practiced mantra meditation for 20 years or so, followed by the direct path teachings of Ramana Maharshi and Atmananda Krishna Menon, and to the tantric teachings, especially those of the Kashmir Shaivite tradition. But now, some 45 years later, I find myself returning more and more often to my original Christian tradition in which I was brought up. And although I had to take this great journey, this exploration through the Eastern spiritual traditions, in order to really discern the meaning that lies at the heart of the Christian tradition, I now find that when I come back to the Christian mystics, their writings are charged with an understanding that speaks as powerfully, if not more powerfully to me than any other tradition. So I just wanted to share some of these writings from you, and in particular from Meister Eckhart, the 12th century Christian mystics whose writings I have always loved and are so consistent with the understanding of the great Eastern wisdom traditions. So I thought I'd share a couple of my favorite passages from this book on his selected writings. This is a passage about the most powerful form of prayer. The most powerful form of prayer, and the one which can virtually gain all things, and which is the worthiest work of all, is that which flows from a free mind. The freer the mind is, the more powerful and worthy, the more useful, praiseworthy, and perfect the prayer and the work become. A free mind can achieve all things. But what is a free mind? A free mind is one which is untroubled and unfettered by anything, which has not bound its best part to any particular manner of being or devotion, and which does not seek its own interest in anything, but is always immersed in God's most precious will, having gone out of what is its own. I love this last phrase, having gone out of what is its own. And this is so so close in understanding to the meditation tradition, the Eastern meditation tradition, which requires the emptying of the mind of all that is not essential to it, leaving its bare, essential, irreducible essence, pure consciousness, pure awareness. And Meister Eckhart goes on to explain this in more detail, how the mind, how the soul, in his language, empties itself of itself, and in doing so progressively surrenders itself to God's presence. This self-emptying is really the essence of the soul's prayer to God, and is, of course, indeed the essence of the great meditation practices of the Eastern traditions. So I read again from Meister Eckhart. Just as we spoke before of emptiness and bareness, saying of the soul that the more pure, naked and poor she is, the fewer creatures she possesses, and the emptier of all things she is which are not of God, then the more purely she grasps God, and does so in him, becoming one with God, and gazing upon him as he gazes upon her, face to face, being transformed into his likeness. I'm going to read that again. Just as before we spoke of emptiness and bareness, saying of the soul that the more she is pure, naked and poor, the fewer creatures she possesses, and the emptier of all things she is which are not of God. Then the more purely she grasps God, and does so in him, becoming one with God, and gazing upon him as he gazes upon her, face to face, being transformed into his likeness. I now say exactly the same of likeness and the fire of love. For to the extent that something is more like something else, to that extent it rushes towards it, and does so more swiftly, and is filled with greater happiness and joy on account of its movement. This beautiful description of the soul surrendering itself, rushing towards, so to speak, God's presence, and in doing so being gradually divested of its own personal attributes, and in its place the joy that is the nature of God's presence shining forth. I now say exactly the same of likeness and the fire of love. For to the extent that something is more like something else, to that extent it rushes towards it, and does so more swiftly, and is filled with greater happiness and joy on account of its movement. The further it departs from itself, and from everything which is not that towards which it hastens, and the more unlike itself it becomes, and unlike all that is not its goal. To that extent, it becomes ever more like the thing towards which it is drawn. This is so resonant of the Sufi mystic Jalaluddin Rumi, who describes this same process of our personal being, our apparently individual being divested of its limitations, and as it does so, seeming to expand and being revealed eventually as God's infinite being, when he says flow down and down and down in ever widening rings of being. This is exactly the same process that Meister Eckhart is describing. The further it departs from itself and from everything which is not that towards which it hastens, and the more unlike itself it becomes, and unlike all that is not its goal, to that extent it becomes ever more like the thing towards which it is drawn. Since likeness flows from the one, and attracts, and draws by and in the power of the one, I need to read that again. Since likeness flows from the one, and attracts, and draws by and in the power of the one, neither peace nor satisfaction comes to that which attracts, or to that which is attracted, until they become one in the one. Our Lord asked his Father that we should be one with him and in him, and not just united. We have a clear analogy for this passage and this truth in nature, which is even a visual one. This is a beautiful Meister Eckhart is addressing here, possibly the final stage of one on the path of devotion, who does not seek simply to become united with God, but to lose their self in God, to be one with God. For to be united with God, the devotee remains, albeit devoted to or united with their beloved. And Meister Eckhart is now saying that that is the last barrier for the path of the devotee, the one on the path of devotion, to lose themselves completely in God's presence, so that nothing remains of their being other than God's being. Of course, all that there ever was to an individual's being, all there ever is to an individual's being, is God's being, infinite being, the only being there is. But in most cases, our being is so thoroughly mixed with the content of our experience that we believe and feel that our being is personal, limited, finite. And therefore we imagine God's being as something at an infinite distance from ourselves, with which we have to unite. And Meister Eckhart is saying that's all well and good, but at the final stage, the one who would be united, devoted to or united with God's being, must dissolve completely, revealing their being as God's being, the only being there is. And then he gives this beautiful analogy. He says we have a clear analogy for this passage and this truth in nature, which is even a visual one. When the fire acts, igniting the wood and setting it ablaze, then the fire reduces the wood to something small, quite unlike its former self, removing from it its bulk, its coldness, its mass and moistness, and making the wood more and more like unto itself. And yet neither the fire nor the wood is satisfied or contented with any warmth, heat, or likeness, until the fire has given birth to itself in the wood, and has conveyed to it its own nature and its own being, so that all becomes a single fire, equally one, without distinction, and knowing neither increase nor decrease. And this is why, until the process is complete, there is always smoke, crackling, and contention between the fire and the wood. We all know what this smoke and crackling and contention feels like. But when all the differences between them have been removed, the fire is still and the wood is silent. I also say in truth that the secret power of nature hates hidden likenesses insofar as this contains distinction and duality, and that it seeks it in the one whose nature loves in likeness, which nature loves in likeness solely for its own sake, just as the mouth seeks and loves the taste of sweetness in and of the wine. If water had the taste which wine has, then the mouth would not prefer wine to water. So this beautiful image of the fire turning everything into itself, the same process that our apparently individual being goes through as it devotes itself to or surrenders itself to God's being in prayer. God's being turns the apparently individual self or being into itself. And I'll just finish with another short passage from another of my favorite Christian mystics, Brother Lawrence, a French Carmelite monk living in the 17th century, 400 years or so after Meister Eckhart, who wrote this book, The Practice of the Presence of God, one of the great texts of the Christian mystical tradition, when he speaks also of this self-emptying, this emptying the heart of everything that is not God. To practice this correctly, the heart must be empty of all other things. God will possess the heart alone. But he cannot possess it solely without emptying it of everything else. He cannot act in the heart and do what he wants with it until it is empty. And perhaps I'll just end. I could read from this book indefinitely, endlessly. Perhaps I'll just end with one quote, which again is so true of the Eastern traditions, where to begin with meditation is something one does for a certain length of time, at a particular time of day, in a particular place or in a particular position, but in time the distinction between meditation and everyday life diminishes until one can no longer distinguish between them. And in this passage, in his 7th letter, Brother Lawrence, in his book, The Practice of the Presence of God, is saying a similar thing about prayer and liberating prayer from its formalities, and really showing that for the devotee of God, there is less and less distinction between prayer and one's everyday life. It is not necessary, he says, to be in church to be with God. we can make our heart a chapel where we can withdraw from time to time and commune with him in meekness, humility and love. Please tolerate and forgive my using the words he and him and his. It's just the convention of the day. So please don't let this be a barrier to your heartfelt understanding of these texts. It is not necessary to be in church to be with God. We can make our heart a chapel where we can withdraw from time to time and commune with him in meekness, humility and love. Everyone is capable of this type of intimate communion with God, some more, some less. God knows what we are able to do, so let us begin to do it. He expects only one heartfelt commitment from us. Have courage. We have little time to live. When we are with him, even sufferings will be sweet and pleasant to us. Without him, even the greatest pleasures will seem cruel. Praise God for everything. Amen. So, those are just a few passages from Meister Eckhart and Brother Lawrence. As I said earlier, I have a weekend coming up, the 6th to the 8th of May, where we will be exploring these texts in our lived and felt experience. So maybe see some of you then. But either way, I wish you all the very best. God bless. Bye.